I certainly am more than delighted to be here. Much of my life and ministry in Africa has been spent seeking to cope with cross-cultural realities and leadership challenges related to this, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But I've been in it quite a bit, and yet I feel my comprehension of these challenges and possibilities is still very limited and incomplete. However, the reality is that cultural or cross-cultural challenges are, as all of us in this room know, unavoidable, given the fact that every time we relate to a person or a group cross-culturally, we are dealing with the totality of learned assumptions and worldviews, often unconsciously held in the other person or group, which determines for them how life works and how behaviors what behaviors are proper, and so on. But the very, very first thing in some ways that I feel we have to grapple with, and this is really a preliminary point, before I move into some stories, which is really what Ralph has wanted me to do out from the sort of trenches of South Africa, is the importance of what I call understanding, the principle of understanding each other's hermeneutical grid, by which I mean that hermeneutical process of interpretation that each of us has and that we bring to any communication, any document, from a newspaper to the Bible to a conversation with someone else. The Germans call it a Vorverstandnis, or a conceptual framework which we bring into all of life. And so each person wears interpretational lenses through which they view the realities and people around them. I have a particular hermeneutical grid. I'm a white person. I was born in Johannesburg, but raised in Basutoland, old Basutoland, now Lesotho, as a colonial. I had certain educational privileges. I went to a church school. I went overseas to university where I found the Lord, and I went to seminary in the States. I can never have the hermeneutical grid of a black person my age or a bit younger, who went through the Soweto riots in 1976 when South African police opened fire on 600 young people. I never had my brother or sister or friends shot down. So I can't bring that particular grid. I was in an exchange recently with a black leader, very, very fine, very highly intelligent, well-educated, and all of that. But he said a few things, but I disagreed with him on a few things and challenged him. And he was very hurt by this. And he said, when you do that to me, you make me feel inadequate and inferior. Now, he said, I don't want you to apologize. You don't need to apologize because you were just being you. But I bring my story and my brokenness to a situation where a white man is disagreeing with me and challenging me. So I hadn't penetrated enough of his pre-understanding, his existential pain, out of the world from which he came. And of course, in terms of this whole thing of gospel and culture, we can either have a posture, as Richard Niebuhr says, where Christ is in opposition to culture, or whereas Christ is made to agree with culture, or a combination where we bring together these things with our Lord above culture. But the reality is that in different ways and different times, the gospel will affirm culture. Like South Africa, the African culture has a thing they call Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is humanness. I am because you are. You are because I am. And it's a wonderful thing of humanity. And that's a beautiful thing to affirm. But we can't affirm in black culture the worship of ancestors. And so that you start to have a country run by the dead. And that's the sort of thing that can happen. So you can affirm culture, critique culture, or judge culture. Now, what I thought, Ralph, I would do And it's terrifying trying to do it in this kind of time, because in Africa, we say to Westerners, you have the watches, but we have the time. But I realize today I don't have the time, and I do have a watch, and so do you. But I suppose the very first experience for us in developing cross-cultural leadership, and that was to develop our African Enterprise Ministry into a non-racial cross-cultural team. So from the very start, we have 10 teams across Africa now that move into all parts of the continent, but our very first team, we made ourselves interracial and cross-cultural. And I used to say to people, I used to have a notice that I put up around our offices saying African enterprise is a testimony before it is a ministry. So you can't go out to South Africa and have a ministry into that bad news culture if your own organizational relational setup is bad news itself. You have to be able to bring the good news. And so we found ourselves in the apartheid context with many different assorted cultural challenges. Obviously, the first and most obvious one is racial. And we've had a de facto segregationist life for 350 years, whites and blacks not together, and then a de jure separation from 1948 onwards with those official policies. Then there were nationalistic clashes, the clash of white culture against black culture, or Afrikaner culture, particularly against black culture. Then ideological. So there was a clash of the view that a segregationist way of political life is the way, because two major groups can't share power in the same body politic. That clashed with the view of, no, we need a non-racial South Africa that was unacceptable to whites. So that brought the political issue. And struggling with this as a cross-cultural team, we found that we could not avoid the political issue. And we were chatting just now, I think Scott was talking about policies and procedures. Well, we found ourselves, it's very difficult when the policy and procedure you consider to be biblically immoral. So we were constantly faced into this, the challenge of challenging the South African status quo in every single thing we did. So our policy was no segregated or discriminated meetings. So that meant around every single corner we were faced up with the authorities, faced up with the police, faced up with the security services, and all of that. So those made tremendous difficulties. And then, of course, there were different religious understandings which contributed to this cultural confusion. Religious understandings of what the Bible teaches about race. And so if the Afrikaner view based on a kind of a Calvinism that God made different racial groups, and therefore in his Calvinistic sovereignty he intended them to remain that way, that's one posture which gave birth to apartheid. But then there were the other theological reading of Scripture, that in Christ is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female. So what a terrific challenge then this was when we got into our first major missions. And I don't have time to talk a lot about these because we've done so many across Africa. But I think of one of the first ones which we did fairly early, 1969, in Nairobi. And here was a black mixed fraternal, a group already cross-cultural, if you like, inviting in a team, yes, cross-cultural team, but from apartheid South Africa. So we were faced with having to demythologize ourselves and break the stereotypes of how people would view a team, that came from South Africa. And the big thing, of course, in these things is to come as servants, as partners. You can't come in as superior. You had to come in as listeners. And listening in this whole thing is incredibly important. I was given a small travel scholarship to go to India and to try and understand how come the Indian church had grown from some 15 million to 75 million in 15 years. And I went and I traveled around India And I'm a preacher. I love to preach. I'm an evangelist. I like to win souls. I didn't preach once. Not once. I only listened. I asked questions for 3 weeks, and I listened and took notes. I wrote a little book called In Deep in India, which was my notes. And the Indians said to me, you were the first sort of Christian leader from the West who came and never preached and only listened. So I've learned in this cross-cultural thing, the importance of listening is absolutely critical. And then listening also to the culture. I mean, when we first went into Nairobi, we had a couple of young interns from the States who were absolutely lovely, lovely young men, 2 guys and a girl. This was 69. In the 60s, you know what the 60s were like. They came with long hair, bell-bottom trousers, rings in their ears and their nose. They loved the Lord as dear, but the locals said, no way, Jose. And so I was called up before the mission started saying, your team is going to break this mission unless something is done about these kids. So what a dilemma. Do I make them have a haircut and violate them? Or did we accommodate the prejudices and feelings of the church in Nairobi? Well, in the end, that's what we did. And we, in order for us to proceed. And it was a sort of thing was incredibly important to listen to what the people wanted and to come in, as a team who would be cross-cultural and who would relate into a cross-cultural context and environment. Then if I move on to, say, another later mission in Johannesburg, one of the things we faced was facing courageously the challenges thrown up by a convulsed political situation. So in 1970, apartheid was in full bloom. And what we had to do was to try and minister in Soweto, where it was all blacks, and in the central city where it was all whites, that was the demographics of South Africa. But we sort of had to do it in a sense under protest. You can't change where Soweto is and where Centre Johannesburg is. So we went in there, but at the same time, we brought a moral challenge to the authorities and to the Prime Minister, saying, you don't know, this place is boiling, and this place is going to boil over. And the word we got back from the government was, no, everything's fine and it's under control. Well, in 1976, Soweto did blow, and 60 or 80 young people were killed. It's still a landmark moment in South Africa's life. But that was a challenge to face. When we did our mission in 1995 to Kigali, 10 months after the genocide, we then had to try and bring together Hutu and Tutsi, who were as alienated as any groups could conceivably be. Curiously, they share a similar culture, but there was a tribal clash, nevertheless, between them. And we had to try and show them that this is not how the church is meant to function. And I was preaching in the prison in Kigali, a prison meant to hold about 400 people. There were 10,000 prisoners in there. And I've never seen any humanity jammed like that. And at the end of my talk, when I said, how many want to receive Christ, almost all 10,000 put their hand up. Then I said, no, just wait a minute. And I had a bench there, and I called up some of my colleagues, a black Malawian, a yellow Singaporean, a white South African, a Hutu, and a Tutsi, and I put them on the platform and said, stand up here, and I want you all to see that if you are coming to Jesus Christ, this is what you are coming to. Here is a visual picture for you of what you are coming to. So that was that kind of challenge. Then in 1979, we put together, we've done a lot of these big conferences, but we brought 6,000 whites and blacks together for 10 days. I can't even start to tell you the difficulties of this. All the opposition from government, police, and everything else. I was told by the cabinet minister, if this thing goes wrong, I'm moving the army in on this conference and I'm going to hold you accountable. I said, no, sir, you don't have to hold me accountable. You don't need the army. God is going to do something here. And we required whites to live in black homes. and blacks to live in white homes. Now, this was absolutely culturally contrary to what was meant to happen. But in that context, incredible things took place. And in the evenings before supper, we had what we call pan-interest groups. So people from a politicians' conference, a youth conference, a young people's conference, a student conference, and a political civic leaders conference would come together in a group of 10 or 12 and share. Now, very interesting, a researcher from Harvard came and he looked at this and he said he had never seen in his life such massive change as took place in the lives of people in the chemistry of that encounter. And out of SECLA, we created a cross-cultural leadership from the church to challenge the society. And indeed, the Dutch Reformed Church was so profoundly challenged by the cross-cultural encounter that they appointed a commission to relook into apartheid. And a number of years later, at their synod, they declared apartheid as a sin. And when they did that, the rug of theological justification was pulled out from under the feet of the government. And more than sanctions, more than cultural pressures, more than sports boycotts, when the church got its act right, that was the beginning of the end for apartheid. Then we had, just a moment or two more, another thing in 1985 called the National Initiative for Reconciliation. We called 450 leaders together at 3 weeks' notice to face the challenge. And in spite of the difficulty of keeping us all together through those days of the whites and blacks, we did keep together. And we stuck together and we came out, not without challenges, as I say, as a cross-cultural leadership force. And we decided we would face the government with the challenge of releasing Mandela, unbanning the freedom movements, and taking the army out of the township. And we decided that in order to help the government understand how seriously we viewed this, that we would call a pray away. Not a stay away, not a strike, but a pray away on October the 9th, 1985. And the day before the pray away, I had a showdown with President P.W. Botha, the Prime Minister, and he said to me, "Mr. Cassidy, this pray away, it will be a total failure." I said, "Well, Mr. President, we'll see. But you need to know this is the white and black and brown Church of South Africa challenging you. And we are going away and we're going to pray for you and for the government." Well, next day, in the rush hour, the busiest road in all of South Africa, from Soweto to the city center of Johannesburg, and I have a photograph of this, there was one cyclist. The whole country stayed home to pray because the government didn't know how to cope with a huge moral and spiritual force of the church leading cross-culturally. And it was something very, very dynamic and powerful. Maybe the last thing, Rolf, before I close, was something else which we did called a Mamelodi encounter. Mamelodi is a township outside Pretoria. And again we got together, and this time, once more, we had all the whites who came to that conference were in a black township, which the government didn't like. But that we all had to stay in black homes. And staying in black homes, we came to understand, the black reality of what it meant for people who lived in a black world, like my host. He had to get up every day at 4 a.m., take a train to Johannesburg, come back at 7 at night, then go back at 4 next day. You understood the structural violence in a sense that they were living under. So, my brother, this is a long story, and I don't have a long time, so I'm going to stop now. But just to say, we've made many mistakes in the past in trying to lead cross-culturally and try to develop cross-cultural partnerships and so forth for mission. But it's been very, very worthwhile. And it's the only way I would want to live, only way I'd want to work. I'd like to ask you to pray for South Africa. We've left apartheid behind, but we're still in a mess. We are really, really in a mess. Mandela deracialized us. Next President, Thabo Mbeki, began to re-racialize us. And the present President, Mr. Zuma, has re-racialized South Africa in a big way. So we're calling for prayer. And a farmer in South Africa, you may know this story, 3 weeks ago, called for a day of prayer. On a farm near Bloemfontein, 1 million people came. I've got a photograph of it. I was there. 1 million in a prayer meeting calling on God for South Africa. And I maintain that if you win the battle in the heavenlies by prayer, you will win the battle on the ground in all the other realities.